Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. No one stopped. That was the part he would remember later. How hundreds of people streamed past the old man who had collapsed against the subway wall. Some glanced down, most didn't even slow their pace. The terminal buzzed with the evening rush, commuters locked in their private digital worlds, earbud shields firmly in place. The old man's weathered hands trembled as he tried to reach for the small cup that had fallen, scattering his day's earnings across the dirty concrete. His breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes unfocused. A teenager stepped over his outstretched legs without looking up from her phone. A businessman in a tailored suit actively changed his path, creating a wider berth around the problem. A transit officer glanced over, sighed, and continued his conversation with dispatch about something else entirely. At the edge of the platform, partially hidden by a column, stood a man in a baseball cap pulled low, dark sunglasses despite the hour, and a worn leather jacket. He had been watching for 3 minutes now, counting each person who passed without helping. When the count reached 47, he pushed himself off the wall. What happened next would be uploaded to 26 social media accounts within minutes, but none of the videos would capture how his hands had been shaking too. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. Harold hadn't eaten in 2 days. At 73, his body couldn't handle hunger the way it once did when he'd been a dock worker 4 decades earlier. The dizzy spells had started that morning, little waves of darkness that washed over his vision, forcing him to grip whatever was nearby. The last one had taken him down completely, his paper cup of coins scattering across the subway floor like worthless confetti. The Grand Central Station terminal had once been his favorite spot. The architecture reminded him of a time when he'd been somebody, when he'd brought his young son here to watch the trains before the divorce, before the layoffs, before the medical bills. Now it was just the warmest place he could find as November's chill settled into his bones. He tried to focus on the shoes walking past, sneakers, boots, heels, but they blurred together as his consciousness ebbed. A woman in scrubs had paused briefly, looking concerned before her phone rang and she moved on. A suited man had actually stepped over his legs, phone pressed to his ear, discussing dinner reservations. The transit cop, Harold had seen him before, deliberately looked away, pretending to be busy. Nobody wanted to be the one to deal with the problem. The man in the baseball cap had been on his way to a private meeting, the kind that required discretion rather than the usual entourage of assistants and security that typically surrounded Robert Downey Jr. He'd perfected the art of urban camouflage over the years. The cap, the glasses, the deliberate slouch that altered his recognizable posture. Most days it worked flawlessly, but today anonymity wasn't the gift he'd thought it was. From his position near the column, Robert had watched the old man's collapse with growing disbelief. At first, he assumed someone would stop. The woman in scrubs seemed the most likely candidate, but when she continued walking, he felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. Then came the businessman, the teenagers, the families, the transit officer. A parade of humanity too busy to see another human in distress. He'd known rock bottom himself once. Before the comeback, before Iron Man, there had been dark days when he'd been the one people avoided eye contact with. The memory still burned, not of his mistakes, but of the people who had stopped to help when he hadn't deserved it. When the count of passing strangers reached 53, something inside him shifted. Fame had given him many things, but in this moment, its greatest gift might be that people would actually pay attention when he finally spoke up. Harold felt his consciousness slipping further away. The sounds of the station, announcements, footsteps, conversations, began to merge into a distant hum. The world was receding, and some part of him wondered if this might be the end. Not how he'd imagined it, surrounded by hundreds of people yet completely alone. His chest tightened with another sharp pang of hunger. The transit officer finally sighed and began a reluctant approach, radio in hand, likely calling for someone to remove the disturbance. His expression made it clear this was an inconvenience rather than an emergency. Several commuters glanced over, sensing something might happen, already pulling out phones, not to call for help, but to record whatever might unfold. Public spectacles were currency in the attention economy, especially if they involved the homeless. The first thing that cut through Harold's fading awareness was the sudden shift in atmosphere. It happened like a wave, a ripple of recognition, whispers, the unmistakable electricity that accompanies celebrity. Even in his semi-conscious state, he felt the change before he understood it. The footsteps approaching him were deliberate, unhurried. A shadow fell across him, and then a voice, familiar somehow, though Harold couldn't place it, said something that no one had bothered to ask in years. "Sir, are you okay? What's your name?" The terminal didn't fall silent. New York never does. But the immediate vicinity became a zone of suspended breath and widening eyes. Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching. Robert knelt beside the elderly man, ignoring the dirty floor and what it would do to his designer jeans. Up close, the situation was worse than he'd thought. The man's skin had a gray pallor, his lips were cracked from dehydration, and the trembling in his hands wasn't just from age. It was from hunger. Robert had seen that look before, in rehab centers and on streets he'd rather forget. "Sir, can you hear me? Are you okay?" he repeated, louder this time. The old man's eyes fluttered. "My name is Robert. What's yours?" He placed 2 fingers gently on the man's wrist, checking for a pulse, something he'd learned from playing doctors in films, though he never thought he'd use it in Grand Central Station. "He's probably just drunk," came a voice from behind, the transit officer, standing with his arms crossed. "We get this all the time. I've called someone to handle it." Robert didn't turn around. "He's not drunk. He's malnourished and possibly hypoglycemic." He kept his voice level but raised it enough that those nearby could hear clearly. The baseball cap had slipped back slightly, and recognition was spreading through the growing crowd like wildfire. Phones were emerging from pockets and purses, recording the scene. "Harold," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. "My name is Harold." "Harold," Robert repeated with genuine warmth. "When's the last time you ate something?" "Yesterday. Maybe the day before," Harold managed. The transit officer shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that cameras were turning his way too. The public narrative was forming in real time, and he was being cast in a role no one would envy. "Look, Mr. Downey, we have protocols." "I understand protocols," Robert interrupted, his voice taking on just a hint of Tony Stark's authority. "And I understand basic human decency. Right now, I'm more concerned with the latter." The crowd had transformed in minutes. What had been a stream of indifferent commuters was now a semicircle of spectators, phones raised, whispers confirming what they were seeing. "That's Robert Downey Jr. Is this for a movie? Is that homeless man an actor?" The reality, that they were witnessing an actual emergency rather than a staged scene, seemed harder for them to process than the presence of a Hollywood star in the subway. Robert ignored the whispers and turned to the crowd. "Does anyone have any food? Something with sugar? This man needs help." The request hung in the air for an uncomfortable moment. Then a teenage girl stepped forward, rummaging through her backpack to produce an unopened Snickers bar. A businessman offered a bottle of orange juice. A mother with a toddler presented a package of crackers. "Thank you," Robert said, making deliberate eye contact with each person who stepped forward. He turned to Harold. "Let's start with the juice." He uncapped the bottle and gently helped Harold take small sips, supporting the back of his head with one hand. The transit officer was now on his radio again, voice lowered, clearly calling for backup. "Mr. Downey, the paramedics are on their way. You really don't need to." "I know I don't need to," Robert said quietly, not looking away from Harold. "That's what makes this situation so absurd. None of us needed to help. We chose not to." The words weren't delivered with dramatics, but they carried. Several people in the crowd looked down at their shoes. A woman in a business suit pushed through the crowd. "I'm a doctor," she announced, kneeling beside Robert without concern for her expensive clothing. "Let me check his vitals." As she began her examination, she glanced at Robert. "I was on the other side of the terminal. Someone told me what was happening." The unspoken admission hung between them. She hadn't stopped earlier either. "Better late than never," Robert said. But there was no accusation in his tone. After all, wasn't that the story of his own life? As Harold's condition stabilized with the sugar from the juice and candy bar, his eyes focused more clearly on his unexpected savior. Recognition dawned slowly across his weathered face. You play Iron Man," he said, his voice gaining strength. "My grandson loves you. Has all the toys." Robert smiled, genuine and unguarded. "That's me. Though between us, the real heroes wear scrubs, not metal suits." He nodded toward the doctor who was checking Harold's pulse. "How's he doing?" "His blood sugar is dangerously low, but the juice is helping," she confirmed. "He needs proper medical attention and a meal. Paramedics should be here soon." The crowd had doubled in size, the semicircle pressing inward as people strained to capture the scene. The hashtag number sign Robert Downey Subway was already trending locally, videos uploading in real time. 2 security guards had appeared, attempting to establish a perimeter, but looking uncertain about how to handle a situation involving both a medical emergency and a major celebrity. A well-dressed man stepped forward from the crowd. "I work at the restaurant upstairs," he said. "We can prepare a proper meal and have a quiet place for him to rest until the ambulance arrives." "Perfect," Robert said, then turned to Harold. "Think you can stand with some help?" Harold nodded, and with careful support from Robert and the doctor, he slowly rose to his feet. The crowd parted, phones still recording every moment. As they began their slow procession, a voice called out from the crowd. "Why did you stop when nobody else would?" The question came from a young woman, her expression a mix of admiration and shame. Robert paused, supporting Harold's weight against his shoulder. The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He could have delivered a polished soundbite, the kind crafted for press junkets. Instead, he looked at the faces surrounding them, the same people who had stepped over Harold minutes earlier, now captivated by celebrity intervention. "Because 15 years ago I was at rock bottom, and someone stopped for me when they didn't have to." His voice carried without him raising it. "They taught me that sometimes a moment of kindness is the difference between giving up and finding a way forward. And that lesson was worth more than every dollar I've made since. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below and let's talk." The restaurant above Grand Central was normally the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance. Tonight, its corner booth became an impromptu sanctuary. The manager had cleared the area of other diners, creating a buffer of privacy in the otherwise packed establishment. Harold sat with a warm bowl of soup before him, each spoonful taken with trembling deliberation. Color had returned to his face, but the profound exhaustion of long-term deprivation remained etched in every line. Robert sat across from him, cap and sunglasses discarded now that anonymity was impossible. Outside, word had spread. The restaurant's windows faced 42nd Street, where a crowd had gathered on the sidewalk below, necks craned upward. Inside, staff members pretended not to stare while taking unnecessarily frequent trips past their table. "You didn't have to do all this," Harold said between careful sips. "The juice would have been enough." "Maybe for today," Robert replied. "But what about tomorrow?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table, a posture his etiquette coaches had tried and failed to break him of. "Tell me about your grandson, and how you ended up at that subway station." Harold's story emerged slowly between bites of food. He'd been a union dock worker for 30 years, a widower, one son who lived in Chicago with his family, struggling with his own finances, sending what little he could. Medical bills after a heart attack had drained Harold's modest savings. The waiting list for affordable senior housing stretched years long. His Social Security check barely covered a room in the worst parts of the city, and sometimes, not even that. "I don't tell you this for pity," Harold said with unexpected dignity. "You asked, so I'm telling you the truth. Most people don't ask." The paramedics arrived, directed to the restaurant by the transit police. They stood awkwardly at the entrance, medical bags in hand, clearly unprepared for the celebrity element of their routine call. Robert noticed how their eyes slid past Harold to him, the gravitational pull of fame distorting even professional focus. "Sir," one of them finally said, addressing Robert rather than their patient, "we should really transport him to the hospital for evaluation." "His name is Harold," Robert said pointedly, "and he's sitting right here." The gentle correction carried weight without aggression. "Harold, these paramedics need to check you out properly. Would that be okay with you?" Harold nodded, though apprehension crossed his face. "I don't have insurance anymore. Can't afford the bills." A heavy silence fell over the table. The American healthcare crisis distilled into 8 simple words from an elderly man's mouth. The paramedics exchanged uncomfortable glances, their professional protocol colliding with brutal economic reality. Robert reached across the table, his hand covering Harold's weathered one. "The bills aren't your concern tonight. I'll take care of it." Before Harold could protest, he continued, "Consider it a loan if your pride needs that. But it's not charity. It's human decency." As the paramedics began checking Harold's vitals, the restaurant manager approached with his phone extended. "Mr. Downey, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's gone viral. Every network is picking it up." He turned the screen to show a social media feed exploding with videos from the subway. The hashtags were multiplying. Robert Downey Hero, Subway Angel, Yash Real Life Iron Man. Robert barely glanced at the phone. "That's not important right now." "But your publicist has called our line 3 times, the manager persisted, "and there are reporters gathering outside." Something shifted in Robert's expression, a flicker of the weariness that comes from decades in the public eye. He'd lived most of his adult life in the awareness that any public action would be dissected, commodified, turned into entertainment. It was the unspoken contract of fame. Harold noticed the change. "You should go," he said quietly, "before this gets bigger. I'll be okay with the medics." "No," Robert said, the single syllable firm as iron. He turned to the manager. "Tell them I'll make a statement later. Right now, I'm having dinner with my friend Harold, and we'd appreciate privacy." He turned back to Harold. Unless you want me to leave? Harold studied him for a long moment. No, he finally said. It's nice having company for dinner. It's been a while. Outside, camera flashes illuminated the windows like silent lightning. Inside, an Oscar-winning actor and a homeless man continued their meal, the power dynamic between them shifting in ways neither had anticipated when the day began. The paramedics confirmed what was already apparent. Harold needed proper medical care beyond what a restaurant meal could provide. As they prepared to transport him, the anxiety returned to his eyes. "What happens after the hospital?" he asked, looking between Robert and the medics. "I go back to the same station tomorrow? Nothing really changes?" The question hung in the air, heavy with decades of systemic failure. Robert was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out his phone and stepped away briefly, speaking in hushed tones. When he returned, something had shifted in his demeanor, the casual charm replaced by focused determination. "Harold, I have a proposition for you," he said, sliding back into the booth. "Not charity, but an opportunity. My foundation has been developing a program for seniors facing housing insecurity. It includes temporary accommodation while connecting participants with proper benefits, medical care, and eventually permanent housing." Harold's eyes narrowed with wary hope. "And you're just happening to mention this now?" Robert laughed, a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Actually, yes. It's still in development, not officially launched. But you've just become our first participant if you're willing. Consider it a pilot program. You'd be helping us refine it before the public rollout." The elegant reframing, offering Harold dignity as a contributor rather than a recipient, wasn't lost on the older man. A smile slowly transformed his weathered face. "So I'd be consulting? Providing feedback?" "Exactly," Robert nodded. "Your experience would be invaluable." Outside, the media circus was growing. Inside, two men from vastly different worlds had formed an unexpected connection. As the paramedics prepared to move Harold to the ambulance, Robert stood to accompany them. The transit officer who had ignored Harold in the subway appeared at the restaurant entrance, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind him stood several other officers, clearly sent to manage the situation that had exploded beyond a routine call. "Mr. Downey," he began, struggling to meet Robert's eyes, "we need to establish a corridor to the ambulance. The crowd is significant." Robert nodded, then spoke quietly to ensure only those nearby could hear. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job now. But earlier today, you saw a human being in distress and chose to look away. We all did, myself included, for too long. The difference is what we choose to do after recognizing our mistake." The officer's face flushed, but he held Robert's gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps even the seed of change. He straightened his posture. "We'll make sure both you and Harold get safely to the hospital, sir. It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it." Three weeks later, Harold sat in a small but clean apartment in Brooklyn, part of a transitional housing complex operated by the newly accelerated Downey Foundation Senior Support Initiative. The program had indeed been in development, though Robert's team had worked overtime to expedite its launch following the Grand Central incident. Harold's medical issues were being addressed by regular doctor visits, and a social worker had helped him navigate the Byzantine process of reclaiming benefits he'd been eligible for but unable to access. On the coffee table before him sat a tablet, a gift from Robert, open to a video call. Robert's face filled the screen, the background suggesting he was on a film set somewhere. "The place is good," Harold was saying, panning the tablet camera around to show his apartment. "Better than good. First real bed I've slept in for 18 months. The feedback from the other participants has been positive too, Robert replied. 28 seniors in the program now, with capacity for 100 more by summer. He didn't mention that he'd personally doubled the foundation's budget allocation after meeting Harold, or that he'd leveraged his Hollywood connections to secure additional corporate sponsorships. What had begun as a spontaneous act of kindness had evolved into something neither man had anticipated. The viral videos from Grand Central Station had indeed sparked the expected news cycle. Celebrity performs good deed, public swoons, but something different had happened in its wake. Rather than fading after the usual 48 hours of attention, the conversation had deepened. Robert had declined the talk show circuit, giving just one brief statement. "I'm not the story here. The story is that we walk past human suffering every day and convince ourselves it's not our problem. I was as guilty as anyone until that moment." The most unexpected development had come when Harold's story reached his son in Chicago. The media attention had made the connection possible after years of lost contact. Now, weekly video calls were bridging the gap between them, healing old wounds. Harold's grandson, the Iron Man fan, had sent a handmade card that now held pride of place on the refrigerator door. "My son's talking about moving back east," Harold told Robert, his voice carrying a cautious hope that had been absent in Grand Central. "Not immediately, but maybe next year when his contract ends. Says he wants to be closer." "That's fantastic," Robert replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Family matters." The conversation shifted to the foundation's work. Harold had indeed become a consultant of sorts, his lived experience providing insights that no amount of academic research could match. Other seniors in the program looked up to him as the first participant, a role he embraced with newfound purpose. "The transit officer from that day came by yesterday," Harold mentioned casually. "Officer Diaz. Said he's starting a new protocol for transit police dealing with homeless individuals. Asked for my input." Robert raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell him?" "That the first step is seeing people as people, not problems," Harold said simply. He actually listened. The ripple effects continued to spread outward. The videos had sparked discussions about urban homelessness, particularly among elderly Americans. Several celebrities had contacted Robert about supporting similar initiatives in other cities. A state senator had reached out about legislation to address the senior housing crisis. But perhaps the most meaningful change was less quantifiable. The shift in perspective for those who had witnessed the incident, either in person or through their screens. Thousands of comments across social media platforms echoed variations of the same sentiment. This made me think about how many times I've walked past someone in need. "They're asking me to tell our story at a fundraiser next month," Harold said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Not sure I'm cut out for public speaking." "You'll be amazing," Robert assured him. "Just tell the truth. It's more powerful than any script I've ever performed." He paused, then added, "I'll be there too, if that helps." "Supporting role only. You're the lead in this one." Harold chuckled, then grew serious. "You know, people keep calling what you did heroic, but they've got it backward. The real courage would have been if someone with nothing to gain and no cameras watching had stopped to help me." He looked directly into the camera. "What you did mattered. Don't get me wrong. But the bigger impact is all the regular people now stopping to help because they saw what happened." Robert nodded, understanding the profound truth in Harold's words. "The best role I've ever played was myself on that day. Finally, being the person I should have been all along." As they ended the call, Harold sat quietly in his apartment, reflecting on how completely his life had transformed in 3 short weeks. From invisible to seen, from disposable to valued, from hopeless to purposeful. Meanwhile, across the city at Grand Central Station, a young woman paused beside an elderly gentleman who was looking confused by the transit map. "Can I help you find where you're going?" she asked. No cameras recorded this moment. No celebrities were involved. No hashtags would trend because of it. Just one human being seeing another and choosing connection over indifference. Elsewhere in the station, near the spot where Harold had collapsed, someone had placed a small handmade sign. Most commuters rushed past without noticing it, but those who stopped to read found a simple message that had been reshaping the station's invisible geography. Before you walk past someone in need, ask yourself, what would you want if you were in their place? Kindness costs nothing but changes everything. And in the constant flow of humanity through the terminal, more people were stopping than before. Wow, what a story. If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think.